The late game. A moment of dread for some, a glimmer of hope for others. What about me, none of you asked? Well, you read the title. The late game itself isn't something I hate. Something I really do hate is the characters whose only option is to get to that late game stage before they can actually do anything. So I don't like late game characters. I mean, that much is clear. Look at my mastery score in League of Legends, you know? Well, allow me to explain myself. I like to exist for the first 20 minutes of a game. Jokes aside, I do have actual reasons, but I have all sorts for all sorts of different games, not just the one. So let's just start off with some of the more generic reasons. Now first, I do want to clarify that I'm not saying late game characters are bad or anything of the sort. If I end up mentioning your favorite character, that's not me going, oh, you're playing a shite character, lad. I'm just saying, I don't really like them that much. They're still fine 9 times out of 10. I mean, there's a few exceptions, which I'll get into, but let's wait a moment. Like I said earlier, I like existing before the late game. Whether that's anything from just the first few gyms of a Pokemon game, the first couple minutes of a game of League, or even that little bit of time before you have your ultimate up in Overwatch, anything of that kind of sort. I don't want to be waiting around until level 11 so I can actually be useful to my team as Kale, or have a Dreepy taking up a slot in my party for 50 levels while only learning 4 moves and having a 289 base stat total. Can you blame me for not wanting that? Late game characters are an investment, except the only thing is sometimes this investment doesn't pay off and ends up losing you the gym battle, losing you the game, losing you your wife, kids, house, the mortgage, all of it gone down the drain. In most cases, the late game character is painful to use early on, the payoff isn't even always guaranteed, and even when you do get to that payoff, sometimes it's not even worth it. When you look at it in comparison to early game characters who are always guaranteed their strength, because, well, the early game always happens. Obviously, early game does come with the nature of, you know, you gotta end the game quickly or do everything you can as fast as you can before you get to the late game stage where 9 times out of 10 you do become useless. But the thing is, a lot of early game characters can still survive at least semi-decently to even pretty well once they are in that late stage anyway. Even if I shift over to Pokemon, alright, let's say Gen 5 we have a Beldum. You are going to be useless against ghosts, rocks, steals, because the only move you have is takedown. You can see what I'm getting at here. A lot of these late game scaling type things, the early game is just so unbelievably painful for them. Like, we've all had a Magikarp. Now look, like, Magikarp will evolve at level 20, but that thing's still painful to level up. Now, all the characters I've mentioned so far have been ones that, let's say, I don't feel positive towards. Whether it's me playing them, playing against them, or just even looking at them from a more game design perspective type of thing, I'm just never really the biggest fan, but I can see the appeal as to why other people would like them. There is one character, however, who I completely disregard what I said earlier about, oh, I'm not going to call your character bad if I do mention them, and that is Nasus from League. Because this creature, okay, look, ignoring his W or else we'll be here all day, alright? Early game, he's pretty weak as far as top laners go. Not horrendous anymore because of how many buffs he's been given by Riot, but definitely not thriving. His mid game, by then, he's got a good amount of stacks, maybe an item or two, and he's definitely doing well. But late game, I mean, sure, he's able to one-shot people with Qs, but that doesn't matter when the guy can barely reach the enemy team before being shredded down by their ADC into nothingness. Now, late game characters aren't just restricted to things like MOBAs or RPGs, since I'd argue there's at least a few fighting games, with the best or most annoying example, really, being Sonic from Smash Ultimate. If you play Ultimate, you know where I'm going with this, but if you don't, well, one of Sonic's best win conditions is to be up 1 stock and then time out the opponent. Probably the most late game only type of strategy that there possibly could be in a fighting game. Waiting until you're 1 up on the enemy and then just not interacting with them. Now, I don't play Smash competitively, so I've never had to deal with this since my friends aren't arseholes, but you don't need experience to see why it's infuriating. I asked one of my friends who plays fighting games way more than I do to see if there were any other late game type characters in them, and there were actually 2 she came back to me with, one being Susanoo in BlazBlue, and the other being Jacko from Gear XRD. So we'll start with Jacko, since the information I got immediately made me tilt. In XRD, it would be much more accurate to describe Jacko as a snowball character rather than a late game scaler, but hear me out. She places down houses which produce different types of minions. If you leave the house alone, they level up, producing better minions, and the only way to stop them is to smack the houses. It's nearly a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. You can hit the houses, but that leaves you open to Jacko, or you can focus on fighting her, leaving the houses alone to level up and spawn more minions and just leaving you more vulnerable. But while yes, I don't like the majority of late game characters, there are a few that I do play and I do enjoy. However, a few exceptions have to be made, and one of the main ones is for them to not be completely obsolete in the early game, which nearly defeats the purpose of them being a late game character. It's a very dangerous line to try and cross, and oftentimes it will result in frustration for players who actually know what they're doing, but can't really do much about it. Like, it nearly just means the only time I'm going to enjoy a late game character is when they're not a true late game character, which in that case, they're kind of broken. Now, to be fair, there are some characters like this who just have one or two saving graces that allow them to exist early, but they're still pretty weak. I'd say there's about two main examples for this, being Kha'Zix and Fiddlesticks in League of Legends, because, well look, the League examples are the easiest ones to give here. You've got Kha'Zix with your isolation damage early, so you can still skirmish a little bit, but you're not exactly thriving until you at least get a little bit of lethality in your kit going, or if your name is a Gurren, well, just anything works with him, doesn't it? There's also Fiddlesticks, who, while yes, he certainly cannot fight as well as a Kha'Zix can early, his ganks are still acceptable considering he's got a point-and-click fear, and his clear speed is nice and fast, so you're going to be getting to that level 6 pretty quickly. And honestly, like Fiddle, he's my third most played, but I will be the first to admit, this creature is broken. I should not be able to get away with as much as I do on him, but that's a discussion for a different video. Another character who fits into this late game, but I actually still kind of like them, dynamic, is Genji from Overwatch. However, I'm really stretching the definition of late game here, so bear with me. Despite what some of my friends may tell you, Genji is actually my most played character in Overwatch. I've always loved him, he is the reason that I play DPS. However, something that I've always hated about Genji is Dragon Blade. Like, it's the worst part of his kit, it's damn near just terribly designed at this point. Whatever about getting him a rework or a rework with him, we're not talking about that at the moment. I've always loved Genji for his non-ulting gameplay. The shurikens, the double jumping, the movement, all of it. That's the most fun part of him for me. Not the running in a straight line towards someone while swinging a blade going shing, 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 and then praying that you can actually get a kill, because everyone on their team is going to be looking at you and throwing every single cooldown your way to make sure that you can't do that. For years in Overwatch 1 and even in Overwatch 2 to an extent, this man has been nothing but a blade bot. It was lock in Genji, charge blade, get blade, use blade, pray that you had a nano on your team for nano boost. Which just for no one is fun. For the Genji player, it's not fun unless they're a psychopathic platinum player. And it's not even fun for anyone on the other team, or even on your own team, because they're down someone for half the team fights. Now, with the recent HP changes, this has changed, and while I do have my own opinion on those that can wait for the moment, the narrative is certainly different now. You can exist outside of Blade, however, Blade has become even worse now, if I'm gonna be honest. Pretty much the one use case I have for Blade anymore is to just jump on PTSD-riddled supports in the hopes that they'll blast all their most important cooldowns on me, just because the second they hear that ult voice line they're absolutely terrified. His neutral gameplay, or his early game as it's called, is actually finally decent now, but for the longest time his ulting gameplay, or his late game as I've been referring to it during this video, well, that was his only option, which, like I've said, isn't really fun for anyone when it's done that badly. Earlier on, I mentioned Susanoo from BlazBlue, but I didn't actually talk about him, and that's simply because he actually belongs in this segment. To give a brief introduction for those unaware, since I needed it as well, in BlazBlue you've got 4 buttons for your attacks. A, B, and C, which are all normal attacks, and then D, your special move. Susanoo has 9 special moves, but only starts off the game with 1 of them. If he wants more, it's not a case of sit back and get gold or XP or anything. He has to combo the opponent by hitting his special when the cursor is over a certain move. This cursor moving forward once for each hit. He's late game in the sense that you need to reach the late game to be at full power, but the way you go about reaching the late game is actually very interactive, which is a rarity for a lot of these archetypes. I also have one more example, which I'd also like to use as advice for others. Do not ask your autistic friends for information regarding their favorite game, unless you know you can do the info dump justice. Because I sure fucking can't, dank. So Risk of Rain, whether we're talking 1, 2, or Returns, they're all bangers, but they've all got one thing in common. The goal is to make you god. Standard roguelike practice really, but all the characters do have varying levels of strength early on in a run, where some can go for an absurd amount of time without grabbing too many items at all, and others need to scour the entire map to make sure that they won't suffer. I'm exaggerating a little bit, to be fair, but you get the idea. One such example is actually one of my favourite characters to play, Huntress. This girl has by far the worst single target damage I've ever seen early on. Her saving grace is another variant of her ore, which lets her rail enemies, but another is her right click, a bouncing boomerang type thing that does more damage per each bounce. It is a slog trying to kill single enemies early on if you don't have your ore available, or more enemies nearby to get some bounces, but despite this, she's so fun and you can get things going pretty quick regardless once you get some crowbars, syringes, or anything that can just make your damage go brrrr. Now I was referring to her in Risk of Rain 2 specifically. I'm not going to get into Returns because, well look, we'd be here all day. So we're in the late game of this video and I may as well end it now. I'm not sorry for that pun. So please, tell me yourselves, do you like late game characters? Do you think I'm completely wrong about my stance on them? I don't think they're completely criminal, but at least when it comes to playing them, they're certainly not my cup of tea. So, like I just said, let me know what you think of them, and if you're still here, drop a like, comment, sub, blah blah blah, all that YouTube stuff, and I'll talk to you next time, lads.
I'm on the road, watch out for all surprises. What it provides is good and bad, but nothing ties us.